studio by our panelists. This is a first, so welcome to this first experience and bear with us as we work our way through this new initiative. Thank you for signing up. You know, as always, Eurofound remains online during this whole process. You are welcome to follow us on the different channels, but also to sign up on social media and follow the chat. Today's Eurofound Live is going to concentrate on bridging the rural-urban divide in Europe. It's a big topic, and as you know, Eurofound has done quite a lot of research in this area. Today, we're going to look at the differences in social, political, cultural, economic, and living conditions. And we're going to have a look specifically at whether these divides, which have been emerging over recent times, are actually threatening the possibility of social cohesion across the European Union. We know that the goal to ensure balanced geographic development is rooted in the Lisbon Treaty. And we know that despite this commitment, we're still seeing some divisions emerging, and that the gaps that have emerged are in income and in living conditions. We also know that the rates of employment and human capital are higher on average in urban areas than in rural. We know that this has broader societal implications, and we're going to discuss that and how that's panning out at a rural level and what the consequences and implications might be. So we do have a lot on our agenda to discuss today, so let's fire ahead. My name is Mary McCaughey. I'm Head of Information and Communication, and I have two of my colleagues here with me today. Marie Hyland on my right, who's a research officer, who's been working in this area over the last while, and Massimiliano Mascherini, who's head of unit of the Unit for Social Policies here in Eurofound, who's responsible for delivering this report, which we have currently online on bridging the rural-urban divide in Europe. And we're greatly delighted to have with us today also an expert in a particular element, which we will be discussing today, Michèle Lamont. And Michèle is currently a Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies and Sociology at Harvard University. So welcome today, Michèle, and to my two colleagues. I know also that you're planning to discuss some of the issues we'll discuss today with the European Commission colleagues at the rest of the week. So I'm glad we have got in here early. So again, I just call on you all to follow us on hashtag Eurofound Live and hashtag Convergence EU if you're going to follow the chat. For those of us who know us, you do know that we have a mandate to ensure that this kind of information is shared with our key stakeholders. So please feel free to share this after the fact with anyone who may be interested. So to start us off, Massi, we've talked about the divide that is emerging here, and we know that there are divides between the rural-urban areas. We also know that there are inequalities and divides in the rest of society. And Eurofound has done an awful lot of work in this area in terms of looking at where convergence and maybe lack of convergence has been happening. Can you just set the scene a little bit for us on the basis of the work that we've been doing?
Absolutely. Territorial cohesion, as you mentioned, is part of the European treaties. It's part of the Lisbon Treaty of 2007. And fostering economic and social development and the cohesion of all territories by narrowing the gap between the most and the least developed countries and regions is a main pillar of the European Union project. Now, if you look at the member state level and the region, we see that this convergence towards the better living and working condition and economic performance happened in the European Union, although there has been a slowdown after the 2008 crisis with some countries and some regions especially that diverge a bit. In this big framework, actually, territories in Europe and regions in Europe are very different. Prominent was in literature the gap between rural and urban areas. Now, if you look at the maps representing the elections results in all Western countries, not only European countries, we see that urban areas and rural areas have different colors. So there is an apparent increasing polarization between rural and urban areas at the political level. So why is that? And this is what we tried to explain with our work. Is this driven by economic and social performances, or there are other factors? Now, just as a high-level overview, actually, we see that economic and social situation in urban and rural areas followed a different dynamics. There are an increase overall of the economic and social performances of all territories, but in some or most indicators, there has been an increase of the gap between rural and urban areas. However, it is just this kind of discontent or this polarization can be only explained by economic and social performances, actually. Well, with our research, we try to answer to this, but also to highlight that there is something more. The way that the citizen feels, actually, especially in the rural areas, is very important, and they can amplify this perception of inequalities by then fostering more this polarization. Clearly, there is a juxtaposition between cosmopolitanism and traditional values, that cosmopolitanism is more close in urban areas and more traditional values in rural areas, but there is also something more. There is a kind of a perceived lack of recognition of the role of citizens and workers in rural areas that do not feel fully recognize their value by our institutions. And so these could amplify, and it amplify the discontent, and then could drive even more to a polarized electoral results in the various member states.
Thanks, Massi. So it's not just about the actual inequalities that we're finding. It's broader than that in terms of, as we talked about at the start, it is very much about how that plays out at societal level. And I think here, if you can just maybe take us to the crux of it, Maria, and tell us, before we move to that impact and implication of the inequalities, can you tell us what kind of inequalities are we seeing? What are you finding at that level?
Yes, absolutely. So our report documents a wide array of socioeconomic inequalities between rural and urban areas. As Massi mentioned, ensuring territorial cohesion is a key objective of the European Union, but despite this, we're seeing inequalities between different geographic areas continue to grow. So if we're looking specifically at the rural-urban differences, we can see in, for example, the income rate. The incomes have been consistently higher in urban areas, and that indeed the income gap between rural and urban areas has grown by almost 20% over the past decade. This also is related, of course, to lower levels of poverty being experienced in cities compared to rural areas. On top of the income gaps, we also see gaps in employment rates. So we see that employment rates are higher in cities on aggregate, but also for particular groups. So we see that the gender employment gap is higher in rural areas compared to urban areas. And we also see that there's a very high rate of youth unemployment in rural areas. We also see important gaps in tertiary educational attainment between rural and urban areas. And indeed, this gap in human capital development has been increasing over time. Compounding the gap in educational attainment, we also see a gap and a growing gap in digital connectivity and skills. So we see that rural residents are less likely to have digital skills than those living in cities. They're less likely to have a computer in their home, and they have slower internet connections in general. And taken together, this gap in educational attainment and in digital connectivity means that cities are in a better position to reap the advantages that can accrue from globalization and technological change relative to those that are living in rural areas. In addition to these gaps that we see in income and opportunity, we can see that from our research that there's a growing service gap in the provision of essential services between rural and urban areas. So, for example, we find through our research that rural residents have to travel further and indeed in many cases significantly further, to reach essential services including schools, healthcare and other care providers. We also found through our research through Eurofound's survey on living and working in the European Union that rural residents are, at least in terms of some services, more likely to be dissatisfied with the quality of the services that they're receiving. On the other hand, one area where we do see rural residents enjoying an advantage relative to their urban counterparts is in terms of housing. So we see that rural residents are less likely to be overburdened by housing costs than those living in cities. And we also find that rural residents are more likely to own their own home, they live in larger homes, and they suffer less from problems including pollution, vandalism, and crime in their neighborhood. So there are some advantages in terms of like the living conditions in rural areas. However, across the wide range of indicators that we look at, with the, of course, important exception of housing, we see that we see significant evidence of rural-urban gaps that are always in favour of those living in cities. So really, despite this objective to ensure territorial cohesion, we're seeing wide and growing disparities between rural and urban communities.
So Marie, we're also looking then at quite a lot of divides within the divide. So we're seeing that there's a division between the rural and urban areas, which has become clearer and clearer. But then within that, you've got digital divides, you've got gender divides, you've got generational divides. So there's an awful lot of elements playing out at the same time.
Exactly, yes, yeah. And we're seeing this, it's important to note that we're seeing this on aggregate, and there are, of course, differences for different rural areas and different member states, but we do see a wide array of inequalities on aggregate across Europe between these two areas.
Yeah, and I mean, what you referenced there is that we're also seeing this loss of social capital. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that's where I'd like to go to Michèle here, is this whole idea that Massi also referenced earlier about the fact that those who are living in rural areas cannot see themselves as recognized. And you've done an awful lot of work on this recognition element, but perhaps you can speak a little bit to this more generally of what that concept is of the mm-hmm. recognition factor, and then we can drill down a little bit to where that plays out.
Oh, absolutely. So Massi and Mary were very convincing in describing all these structural inequality and access to resources. How this is experienced by citizens translates into what one might call a recognition gap that adds to all these other gaps. And recognition is really whether and how much people perceive themselves, their group, as worthy, as being a priority for the government, as having voice when it comes to a political decision. So in general, one can think of this as part of our shared definition of who matters in our society. And added to the evidence that they have presented is the fact that many rural people perceive themselves as really increasingly falling at the bottom of the status order. And this feeds a feeling of resentment that really affects how they understand how much they want to contribute to pursuing, the major objective in society. If they increasingly feel marginalized, this might create a lot of oppositional attitude toward the decision of the government concerning, for instance, positive discrimination in favor of ethno-racial minorities or immigrants. So the repercussions at the political level are obvious, and they have fed the growing presence of a more conservative government across a number of European countries. And of course, this is also very salient in what's happening in the United States. One of the main explanations of the rise of Donald Trump has been this left behind hypothesis, which is not only applied to the white working class that has suffered from desindustrialization, but also the regions which are supporting the Republican Party and which tend to have been, in general, in a phase of economic decline.
So clearly, what you're saying is you recognize that also in sort of the Trump phenomenon and what's ongoing at the US. You referenced sort of quickly there the European scene, and I know perhaps you don't feel that you're in a complete ability to comment on that. But would you say that plays a significant role in what we're seeing playing out at at various levels on a political level, people feeling disengaged, mm-hmm. excluded? what we're seeing in terms of social unrest, that lack of social cohesion?
Oh, absolutely. We know, for instance, that Brexit has often been experienced as a result of this rural-urban gap, as a larger proportion of the population in the north voted in support of it. We're talking, a week after the election of a far-right party in the Netherlands, which has very much appealed to anti-immigrant feelings. So this is not as much about the urban-rural, but it's about, the anti-diversity appeal of politicians, which often goes hand in hand with the anti-urban appeal that we're talking about. So this has a lot of ramification, I think, across a number of advanced industrial societies. And it is feeling indifference, certainly. We know that people who are not college educated tend to vote in smaller numbers than the college educated. So they're already very distrustful of politicians and institutions in general. But certainly this growing inequality between the urban and the rural amplifies this tendency among the non-college educated.
And do you see that also, Massi, with for example, the results of the e-survey that we did during COVID? Do you see that kind of sort of breakdown of trust in the social fabric also happening in the same way that is being described here by Michèle?
Well, I think that the destruction of the social fabric and the decrease of trust in institutions and in official channels actually is happening everywhere in the Western world, actually. And so we can find similar trends actually in European countries as well. What we observed was that as a result or following the COVID pandemic of 2020-2021, trust in institutions started to decrease differently in different type of social demographic groups. So in some sense, yes, there is a huge diversity between young men, older men, young women, older women, as well as well-educated and not well-educated. We are assisting in terms of social capital in a kind of fragmentation of various social demographic groups in the society. And this, for example, was very visible when the vaccination entered in the debate. I think that was a tool that was for reaching a solution for the pandemic that became a huge and divisive and polarizing argument. Which actually was a bit of a catalyst of also economic and social discontent. So these actually reflect that the different groups, social demographic groups, actually on the basis of their education, on their employment status, as well as on where they get their information. There is a huge divide between those that use traditional form of information and those who use social media as a main source of information. Is basically bringing to different developments in terms of trust and a different level of deterioration of trust in institutions.
I mean, just to come back to that differentiation, that it's not a homogenous group that we're talking about. And I think that's important. And you referred there to the differences between men and women, for example, but also between older and younger people. And maybe just to pick up the point there of the men or perhaps the younger and the older groups, can you give us some of the specific differences that you've seen between young and old in the rural-urban divide and also between men and women?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of gender, where we really see the difference is in terms of employment. So we see, like, as I mentioned previously, this larger gender employment gap that we see in rural areas. And I think this maybe relates very importantly to another point I made, which is about the provision of services. So in order to address issues like the gender employment gap, it's really important to have the right infrastructure in place that facilitate women's involvement in the workplace and their continued involvement in the workplace after they have children. So, for example, having like good quality childcare within a reasonable distance is really, really important. In terms of the different demographics, so what we do see, of course, is that the demographic structure of rural versus urban areas is very different. So we can see, obviously, there is a much older population living in rural areas. We see a large migration over time of young people from rural areas into cities where they view opportunities as being greater. And then also this has kind of a long-term implications, because it means that we see lower levels of fertility rates in rural areas, and this kind of population decline is really being driven by two different avenues, which is migration outwards and then lower fertility rates. So there are really important differences between rural and urban areas in terms of their demography. But we do see that for most of the results that we investigate, even after we account for these really rich array of demographic characteristics, we still see differences between rural and urban areas. So it's more than just the makeup of the population. There's something specific to the place that is also leading to some of the differences that we see.
Thanks, Maria. I mean, we've talked before, Massi, about the convergence machine, you know, and how it was working really well for a long period of time, and then it stumbled a little bit with the Great Recession, and then again during COVID. But is this rural-urban sort of divergence, is that an outlier, or are we seeing the convergence machine largely, I suppose, getting back on track?
No, convergence machine is back on track in Europe. Europe was defined as a convergence machine due to this capacity of propelling well-being and economic performance of least performing countries towards best performing countries, not only in the economic level but also in social dimension. The convergence machine slowed down during the financial crisis, and thanks also to the policy response that happened during COVID, the effect of the COVID on the convergence machine was not as strong as for the financial crisis. So the convergence machine is on track. However, we need to go more in detail on this. And so if you go at the regional level, actually, we see that there are differences among regions. There is a set of regions that can be the south of the south or the east of the east that are more at risk of economic and social divergence. And for this reason, actually, we need to implement policies and tools in order to avoid that the regional divergence could then lead to the population of these areas, as well as a situation where economic growth do not reach these regions, so that to fully integrate them in the European Union project and to may have reached by economic recovery and social prosperity.
Yeah, and that's interesting, the differentiation, because one of the things that I noticed also in the report was about that it's not, you know, a sort of a sad story everywhere, that in certain areas, I think is it Germany and the Netherlands, where we've actually seen the gap closing when it comes to income between rural and urban. So there must be some good things going on in some areas or some regions. Can you talk to us a little bit about the success stories, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I realized that the statistics that I presented earlier presented quite a bleak picture, but in the report we also do have some really interesting case studies of thriving rural areas. And I think it's important to highlight that here we talk about urban versus rural, but of course rural areas are not all the same as each other, and likewise urban areas. And we see some really interesting examples of how certain rural areas and rural communities have managed to reverse this trend of population decline and kind of a lagging economic growth. Investment seems to be really, really important in these areas. And you can see that investing in good quality public services, but also having the buy-in of local communities seems to really matter. So we see some really nice examples of where people have made use of the natural resources, the natural advantages that rural areas do have in many instances, and with the engagement of the community and volunteer organizations, that they have managed to really invest in their area and their communities to bring back jobs in, to kind of to make the areas very attractive places to live and to work. And you can definitely see some of this as well in light of the slightly changing structure of how we work in the post-pandemic period, where there's more opportunities to work remotely or in a hybrid fashion. And you can see that the investment in digital connectivity is really important to allow rural areas to benefit from some of these changing trends in the world of work.
Thank you, Marie, on that. And Massi, I'll come back to you also on perhaps the role that the EU policymakers could have in this. But also looking at this, Marie, because you've looked so much at the recognition factor and the impact it has, you must also have seen some way of addressing that makes sense, that we could maybe take as good practice or that we could use into the future when we're looking at the kind of issues that are emerging now.
Oh, absolutely. I actually published a book this fall titled Seeing Others that is very much as an agenda to try to encourage people to work toward broadening recognition for all people, focusing, for instance, on what employers can do. I talk, for instance, about the emphasis on care work to approach workers not only as producers, but also as caregivers, and approaching them as more fuller human beings gives them much more loyalty toward the employers and also cultivates, a feeling of collective commitment toward all. Much can be done also at the level of policymakers if they, for instance, ask themselves questions about the implicit messages about who belongs and who's less important in the pecking order as they define their policies. Often policy schools don't train students to ask themselves these questions. And then, of course, there's much that we can do as citizens as we make decisions about engaging more in opportunity hoarding by giving more resources to our children versus being more committed toward redistributing through, for instance, supporting the creation of affordable housing in our neighborhood. I also give the example of how various major cities in the US have dealt with the housing crisis. Where I live in Boston, there's a strong local elite that is very much tied to the region and that has supported major investment in homelessness, which is not happening to the same degree in some of the other American major cities that are facing a huge crisis in homelessness. So clearly, these are, areas where much can be done in terms of cultivating a stronger feeling of togetherness, which is connected
of engagement,
which is connected to quality of life.
Of course, yeah. And I'm interested by your reference there to asking the right questions or including the right questions in the process. What, can you give us an example of that? What does that mean?
Well, for a long time, low-income people in the U.S. have access to food stamps. They would show up at the grocery store with actually a card that described them as low income and give them access to. Now this is done through means of distribution that are far less visible to others, which means that low-income people don't have to feel that they are being outed as low-income people when they go to the. So those, I think, often economists are more concerned with the redistribution of resources and might not be as attuned to the implicit messaging that is built into the policies that are put in place.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, Massi, do we see a reflection of the rural community? Do they see themselves as marginalized? They may not feel recognized, but do they consider themselves to be a marginalized group in that way, that the questions could be addressed towards them in that way? I know it's a long-winded question, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, I think that I don't think that rural communities see themselves as marginalized, actually, but surely they would like to have a more central role in the design of policies. And for this reason, I think that it's important to think about place-based policies, because centralized policies are important in order to address big issues, but the implementation and the design, if done at the local level in rural areas, can be much more effective, because people of the area know really has really the right knowledge in order to design the policy instrument in the most effective way, in order to address issues that may have a different connotation at the local level. So I think that the development of place-based policies could be very important in order to have the voices of rural communities heard by our policymakers, by feeling that these voices are heard and then used in order to address issues that can improve the entire areas and then foster social cohesion in the member states.
And that maybe feeds into my earlier question to you just about the role of the different levels of policy making in this process. You know, what role do you see as specific then to an EU policymaker as distinct from this, you know, kind of segmented, more regional, local-based approach? And what about the role of, Michèle referenced the employers, but I suppose social partners as well, when we look at trying to play this out?
Well, I think that the role of employers and social partners is essential because they are those who are deeply involved in the life of the areas and on the economic tissues of the area. So therefore, they are the best placed in order to understand the needs of the areas, as well as in terms of labor market needs, in terms of opportunities that there are in the area, and so to contribute to make the flourish in the area. And in terms of workers, clearly there is a full knowledge on the characteristics and the dynamics of the area, and so therefore their involvement in the design of policies and in the implementation is crucial.
So a segmented approach in terms of implementation, but also in terms of how we deal with the policy-making process itself.
Yes, I think that is an holistic approach in this is the one that would be more efficient. Understanding the needs at the local level, and then make this grow towards the national and then the EU bodies in order to flag what is needed and then to implement it at the local level.
Okay, if you don't mind, we're going to go for a few questions already. We have questions coming in from the audience, and we like to be as interactive as possible. So I'm going to take a question from Paul, who's asking, I think I'll put this to you largely, Marie, what are the causes of these inequalities? The big question, the gaps. And one would think it varies from country to country. You've referenced that is the case. Could you give specific examples? But essentially, he's saying this is found the world over. What's so special about Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very tricky question to answer, because I think that what's driving it can be quite different at the member state level, but we definitely do see some aggregate patterns. So this movement of people from rural to urban areas has major implications for the provision of services in rural areas. It becomes much more costly to provide essential public services because the per capita costs are higher. It also leaves an older population with maybe more needs. So this leads to a greater draw on the resources of rural areas. Then also this phenomenon that I highlighted of the growing employment and human capital gaps is really, really important, because that has really long-run implications. In order to have growth in the long term, we need to foster human capital to create employment opportunities. This is really, really important on aggregate and also at the member state level.
Now, just following on from that, this question from Ruggero, I hope that's right, who asking a specific question about Austria and saying that it looks like it has several socioeconomic conditions that are better in rural than urban areas. Do you have any comments on that? I appreciate you may.
No, but I think it's a very valid point. You'll see examples of that in every member state. You'll see certain areas where rural areas do better than urban areas. So what we present in the report when we're looking at these socioeconomic gaps, it's really, we're looking at the aggregate pattern of changes over time, but we also do present some results at the member state level. And it's not always the case that rural areas are underperforming relative to their urban counterparts. There are very important differences in different domains in different member states. So, for example, we often see that for people on low incomes, they may be struggling a bit more in cities compared to rural areas because of cost of living. So I think that can be one very important aspect that's at play in many countries.
Okay, and maybe a question here from Jose, who's asking about the brain drain issue, which is clearly something which we're experiencing at all levels, but here, the rural-urban, and also he says here on top of the flight from east to west, is it possible that this poses a vital long-term danger to the European project itself, and has enough been done so far to address this problem? I mean, I could actually ask that.
That's a very interesting and stimulating question, actually. The freedom of circulation of goods and people is one of the pillars and the cornerstone of the European Union project. Clearly, the fact that people move from different areas and people goes where opportunities are across Europe is the great value added of the European Union. And so mobility is a positive thing for the European Union. However, sometimes it has not the same effect in the regions or in member states where people live, actually. So it is important that this would be actually addressed and can be an instrument can be built in order to smooth the effect of mobility. There are several member states that has put in place measures in order to reattract talent, to reattract brains. I don't like this expression, actually, but several and also successful are these instruments. So therefore, mobility becomes a temporary situation, a period where the individual goes abroad, goes in the capital, goes somewhere else, in order to enrich his human capital, for then coming back to the region of origins, actually, and enrich with a higher level of human capital, with higher level of expertise and innovative solutions, actually. And if I may, I also wanted to complement actually the question before. Yes, it's not that rural areas are bleaking. Actually, there are marvelous examples of flourishing areas. And in this regard, in our report, we made case studies, actually, and one that was found was on a little village in Tuscany, actually, this village of Peccioli, that basically suggests the importance of investing in innovative solutions. So the municipality of Peccioli actually invested in recycling of waste, actually. And on this basis, with the return of this investment, they valorized all the territory, creating arts installations across the territories, therefore attracting a lot of tourists, and so revamping the economy and bringing this little village that is being founded in the Middle Age to the 21st centuries. And I think is a very important example on how innovation and innovative thinking actually can be instrumental in order to relaunch and to make flourish rural realities.
Yes, and that's good actually to move a little bit to a slightly larger question, and I'm vaguely moving away from the core question from Maurizio, who's asking about how kind of the comparison of economic performance in the rural areas, but how that contrast is perhaps undervalued in a financial services perspective. And you talked there about value, you know, and how recognition is linked to the values that we have, and also how we value people and perhaps regions also. And I'm just wondering, how much is it about money? You know, how much is it about where we put the money, where we provide the financing?
Well, I think it's not only about money, because maybe a lot of college-educated professionals and managers define their worth in terms of their social status, but that is not the case for the lower half of the social ladder. People who don't make a lot of money or who don't have occupational prestige will often define their worth in terms of their relationship with each other and what kind of father, mother, friend they are. So it's very important to not only define worth in terms of economic success. And to go back to the example that was just given about this Italian village, there's also often sometimes pushback against gentrification if it leads populations, low-income populations, to not be able to live in a specific place because the rent are going up and they feel excluded. It destroys, they read these kind of changes as destroying their ability to live in a community. So these factors have to kind of be counterbalanced, because for low-income people, often having a community is precisely what allows them to raise their children together, because they can depend on each other. Quality of life is often connected to the integrity of the community in which they live. So it's not only about economic prosperity.
No, exactly. And the community that they live in. I mean, one thing we haven't touched upon yet, which is actually not so good on my part, is the whole idea of the rural communities and the aspect of the green transition. You know, the idea that, you know, what we are moving towards now in terms of climate change and how that's going to impact on rural communities as distinct from urban communities. I mean, there's a question in here also from one of our listeners, from James, who's asking about the differing attitudes to climate change between rural and urban communities. And could this actually be at the core of sort of maybe propelling us into a more serious situation because of the implications of what's required now in terms of the green transition?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question and a really important issue for policymakers to grapple with. I think, you know, one of the really serious implications of this lack of social cohesion, or this failing social cohesion that we're seeing, is that we're losing the buy-in of citizens, which is making it harder for policymakers maybe to make some of the hard choices that need to be made in order to move us towards a more sustainable future. In terms of the implications of the green transition for rural areas, I think what we really see here is that the importance of ensuring that policies don't exacerbate the inequalities that we already see, that where hard choices need to be made, that communities are adequately compensated for the costs that are imposed upon them for the necessary changes that need to be made.
So again, we're talking about employers also and how they view that change and how it is implemented at a rural level.
Yes, exactly. Employers and then also policymakers to think about, like, obviously at the level of the employee, but also at the household. There's important costs that are going to be imposed on the household level that need to be adequately accounted for, and policies really need to be kind of cleverly designed to ensure that we're not placing an undue burden on people who are already feeling a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually, in order to have a green transition that is endorsed by all the different groups of the population, it is important that there is an equitable distribution of the various costs that the green transition could bring. We saw in the recent past the movement of the Gilets jaunes in France, the Movimento dei Forconi in Italy, actually, that were expressing in some sense the discontent arriving from more rural areas. So it is essential that the social aspect of the green transition in terms of cost that each of us and the various groups will have to face is addressed in the most fair way, actually, in order to provide the necessary support to this policy-driven transition.
But I mean, coming back to what you said earlier, Massi, and I mean, it all comes back to this trust element. I mean, we saw in the research that those communities or countries that had greater trust levels tend to adapt better to those kind of social changes or requirements in terms of, for example, the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing that also in your work, is that trust is really, it's what pivots, everything pivots around this. Mm-hmm. So, you know, other work that you'll talk about is about providing high quality, accessible public services, you know, and I'll get Massi to talk to that. But from your working perspective, you know, how do you build the trust in a society, in a community that allows these kind of changes then to take place in a seamless fashion without the kind of unrest and sort of pushback that we've seen elsewhere?
Well, I'll give an example of the research of one of my colleagues at Harvard, Stéphanie Terlot, who has looked at different towns in Wisconsin that are, you know, red or blue, and she looks at the centrality of organizations. Organizations are crucial in the creation of social capital. That's where people learn to live with each other and listen to each other. And she found that those towns that have stronger social organizations are typically better at dealing with questions of distribution of collective resources, because people have ample occasions to get to know each other and deliberate. So creating conditions where people can exchange and really listen to each other's priority is really important. So you have a lot of rural areas in the US that have been defending fracking, which is obviously very negative for the environment, but they do because it's a way of gaining, you know, employment for really poor communities. And if the local leadership is able to come up with other alternative for creating employment, the opposition really is greatly weakened. So that's the kind of collective thinking that is enabled by the existence of collective organizations. But if those are not there, if there's no churches, for instance, to bring people together, it's very difficult to think about alternatives.
So community involvement, building
Yes.
up that social capital, yeah. I mean, Massi, talk to me a little bit about trust. I mean, it's one of my favorite subjects, but yeah, talk to me how this can play a part in what we're talking about today.
Well, trust is the glue that holds us all together. We are together because we believe that inevitably we trust each other. Actually, we trust that institutions actually will provide services and goods that will make our life better and will make us full citizens. Actually, so in this regard, the lack of trust, the collapse of trust actually would bring social cohesion at risk, and this is something that is very alarming. Now, if we think to the importance of public services that you mentioned earlier, actually, public services in some sense is the face of the institution in the territory, because they provide essential services that are essential for our quality of life and living conditions. These can range from the provision of social protection, education, healthcare, and access to digitalization, for example, that now is seen as an essential services. So the provision of good quality public services and affordable essential services is the key in order to foster trust in institutions and to revert this trend, because it's a sign that tell us that the institutions are on the territory, they are working in order to make the life of our citizens better. So the provision of these services, it is essential in order to revert trust, a declining trust. And in fact, in this regard, in the past, Eurofound has made several studies that were correlating the quality of public services with the level of trust in a territory, showing that the better is the service provided, the higher is the trust that we have in institutions. So if I have to think to the first instrument in order to foster trust in our societies is improving the services or the quality of public services and the access of public service. And this is even more important in rural areas that may have additional difficulties because the density of the population is lower, distance is higher. So providing services for improving the access to healthcare to everyone, for example, through digitalization, through digital doctors or telemedicine, actually, it is very important, because one thing that we found also in the report is that a lot of people in rural areas actually sometimes do not go to receive to doctors actually and to receive healthcare services because they are too far. And so in order to address these services should be provided and must be provided in order to make everyone to reach these services in a very fair way.
So in some ways, you've gone towards answering another question that came in from Renee, who is asking, are there specific measures on EU level that you would like to see to address the challenges we've been talking about? Certainly that's some of it. Do you have any that you would add specifically to that?
Well, I think the one specific area is digital connectivity. So it's really, really important. So Massi talked about public services in general, and then also the potential role of e-health in terms of addressing some of these service gaps that we're seeing. But a lot of the more innovative solutions to service provision to tackle those living in rural and in particularly remote rural areas really depend on having good internet connectivity. And when you look at the data across the EU, you can see really stark differences in the quality and the speed of broadband connections between rural and urban areas. So I think in terms of investing in infrastructure of this kind, it's really important, both for service provision and then also back to the point I made earlier about, facilitating this move to hybrid and to online work, and to ensure that rural communities are in a really good position to benefit from any of the gains there. So I think that's really key policy at the EU level is investment in this type of infrastructure.
And I suppose also, Marie, talking about this year being the European Year of Skills and looking particularly at rural areas, I mean, there is sort of a need there for us to address the skill changes that are required at a rural area to ensure the kind of things you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because we do also, in addition to the gap in digital connectivity, we also see an important gap in terms of digital skills. So it's not really fair to ask people to go and use telemedicine if they're uncomfortable with using a computer or if they're not familiar with the technology. So I think that investing in digital skills is really important, and then also the other skills that might be and play an important part of the green transition and the changes in employment structure that might take place.
Exactly, the sort of retrofitting things that we've been talking about. Changing people from their previous professions into one that makes sense for sustainable future and employment.
Yeah, and that requires investment and training now to reap the benefits in the longer term. Exactly.
I'm going to take just this one final question here before I come to you all for your takeaways from today's session. There's one question here from Connor who's asking, could the intrinsic communality of rural areas act as a catalyst to enable urban areas regain their communality? Who'd like to take that? I think the answer there really is the communality that I think you were talking about also, Michèle, there about bringing communities together in a way that gives them a plus, if you like, an advantage.
And the big advantage, of course, is that of rural areas is the lack of anonymity, which, let's face it, can be extremely destructive also in urban areas where there's a great deal of indifference.
And isolation.
One of my friends was in charge of preparation for a disaster in LA, and he put around some big billboards saying, get to know your neighbor because the next big earthquake is coming. And, if you don't know your neighbor in the context of a disaster of this type, you're really done, So I think the question is very apropos, and I think that's one of the good things that the COVID brought us, really an understanding of the interdependency and also the celebration of essential workers who were largely invisible. So I think indeed this is a great question and there's much to learn. And I think
and again, building up that trust with your neighbor, which I think you referenced in a previous seminar that we had earlier, on welcoming our new neighbors perhaps into a community in a way which makes them also feel part of it, that we're not divided within those communities. So.
Exactly. And incidentally, I learned recently that with the decline of religion in the US, many working class men are now going to National Rifle Association meeting as a way to experience togetherness. So the increased popularity of guns is not only about the culture of masculinity and violence, it's also about people searching communities where there are communities.
I mean, so that's an aspect of the community. I'm not sure we want to end on that.
I think that's for the men's chance.
If you're a hunter,
Okay, well, we'll move swiftly on to the key takeaways. Marie.
Yeah, so I think that this report shows the challenges that rural areas face relative to their urban areas, but also some of the rich strategies that are being deployed in a rural area. So I think one really important takeaway from the research in this area is just the need to learn from each other what has been successful. So we have a really interesting policy chapter in the report that looks at very specific strategies that have been deployed across member states to address a particular service gap, and that's the need for healthcare for older populations in remote areas. And there's some really innovative and interesting solutions being deployed across the European Union. So I think there's really great scope for us to learn from each other how we can scale up these particular successful initiatives and also to tailor them to member states. So I think the EU has a really important role in terms of coordinating here that can be played.
Great, thank you, Marie. Massi. I'll give you 3 minutes.
Yes, I have two take-up points actually. But the first one is that a bit broader actually, and is as was discussed today. Actually, money is not everything. It's not that just with economic growth we will bring the solution and we remove the discontent that there is visible in our societies. There are more deeper things that are more on the social sphere, that are the sense of identity, the sense of community, the trust in each other and how we are recognized and our value is recognized in the society. These are very important and probably has the same level of importance of others, more material things, actually. So we should not forget this. The second thing that the second take up actually very quickly is a thing that we didn't mention actually till now, but it represents an opportunity for the development of rural communities, and it is the surge of the remote work that we have, working from home a lot to basically working from everywhere, and therefore this could be an opportunity in order to relaunch several rural communities. And to revamp them. Clearly, this depends on a lot of factors that have been mentioned. One is the development of digitalization and broadband connectivity, innovation, and then the provision, again, of public services, quality education, quality healthcare, and the combination of all these factors actually could give an incredible boost to relaunch and revamp several rural areas.
Excellent, and not to forget the availability of childcare.
And development of childcare.
Michèle.
Yes, well, I think that as Massi was just saying, money is not everything. So encouraging policymakers, including EU technocrats, to really think about maintaining the dignity of groups that are often perceived as being at the margin of our society is absolutely crucial. Redistribution of services is crucial, in part because it signals how much of a priority these populations are to policymakers. You know, money speaks, but most importantly, people feel that they need to be consulted and brought in. And a lot of the criticisms that have been addressed to the EU was precisely its ignorance of populations that are marginalized. So I think that should absolutely be a priority, not only through the development of or the distribution of resources, but also to a consultative process. And more attention should be put on the organic from below ways of creating community that are so important for rural population, but from which urban population can certainly learn, as we're thinking about all the downsides of urban living that are certainly being well documented. So
yeah, super. I think we can very definitely end on that money speaks, investment speaks, but people need to be heard. So thank you very much to my panelists here today, to Michèle, our distinguished guest, to Massi and to Marie for giving us a really fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed our studio. Please, thank you all of you for joining us today and for your insightful and interesting questions. I hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will be at the end of this month, hopefully on climate change. Also, I would ask you to follow us via our website for more information on so many of the topics we've talked about today, on gender equality, on climate change, on the Green Deal, on essential workers, really whatever you're looking for on this debate, we have more information available for you. You can check out our podcast series, also Eurofound Talks, and we will be continuing to flesh that out over the coming period. So thank you again for following us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Have a good afternoon.
great.
Very good.
Thank
Well
you.
done.